You're listening to China Manufacturing Decoded from the Sofeast Group. Hello, welcome to today's episode. Adrian hosting. I'm joined by Renaud. Hello.
Hey, Adrian. How's it going? What are we talking about today?
Yeah, doing good, thanks. And hopefully all the listeners are doing well too. Today, we're talking about life cycle assessments. If you're a manufacturer or you are developing products in some way, this is one of the tools that you probably need to understand to improve sustainability and actually meet growing regulatory demands, which we'll be going into for products these days. So throughout this, we're going to break down what the life cycle assessment is, why it matters, and how it could help your business. So that's kind of the preamble to it. So let's get into it and start off by just giving an overview of the life cycle assessment, please.
Well, first, it's about the product, right? Usually, it's not about, like a manufacturing facility or something like that. No, we're looking at a product through its life cycle. So whenever you work on trying to understand, okay, what is the environmental impact of a product? You need to take the view of its life cycle. Okay. So something that you've probably heard a lot over the past 5 or 10 years is, well, why have an electric vehicle rather than a internal combustion engine vehicle, right? And if we compare, so a traditional car will have an impact on the environment when for example, the extraction of the minerals and all the processing of that, is done. So we get the steel that itself, is rolled in coils and then is sent to the car plant. Okay. And then it's not just the steel, of course, it's, the plastic granules will come from oil that's been extracted and then refined and then shipped left and right. And you have so many things, right? A lot of electronics and glass and so on and so forth. But if we just take the steel, so you extract rocks basically from the ground. You break them, bring them around to a facility where there's some processing, then you bring it again to another place where there's some more processing, etc. And then you have, let's say you have steel coils, okay, which is sort of a raw material, if you want, used to make a car. Okay, so that's the same for traditional car or electric vehicles, all right? But I'm just starting simple here. Something that people can understand because there's a lot of steel in a lot of cars. Then it gets cut and punched, stamped, sort of formed basically. It gets formed and welded into the frame of the car, right? Sort of the skeleton of the car, right? Okay. And all of that is just to make the car, but it's already consumed, a lot of energy to transport all these things, to process it. Making steel is very energy intensive, very polluting often. Okay. That activity emits a lot of gas, a lot of greenhouse gas, and consumes electricity that itself to be generated very often means, burning coal or natural gas and things like that, that again emit a lot of greenhouse gas. Maybe some destruction of, the places where it's extracted and consumption of a lot of water maybe, and release of a lot of polluting water to the soil and so on and so forth, right? A lot of this is just during the extraction and the manufacturing of the product, but then the full life cycle keeps going on, right? So that car will be on the road and it will consume gasoline, okay, or something else, but that gasoline, let's say for internal combustion engine cars, needs to be extracted, needs to be transported, processed, refined, transported, stored, and so on and so forth. All of that has an impact again in terms of energy consumption, release of greenhouse gases, etc.,
Hmm.
etc. And then the end of the life cycle is the car, is brought to a certain place where it's going to be sort of compressed and then, sort of melted again to recuperate certain things and so on. Okay, so that's the full life cycle, right?
Mm.
Now, when you look at the electric vehicles, why do a lot of people say, oh, that's, is much better? Well, the positive is that generating the energy to run the car is much more efficient if it comes from the batteries. Okay. Most of the energy is actually used to power the car. It's much more efficient. Okay. And it by itself, the car does not emit, greenhouse gases. Okay. So, but that's just looking at the use of the car, right?
Mm.
And it might be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Okay, people might go long distances with the car and so on, right? So it's a long time. But if you just look at that, electric vehicles are absolutely amazing, right? Of course, everybody should ride an EV. The problem is in the extraction and processing of the materials that go into these batteries, that is much more impactful on the environment than the process of making traditional internal combustion engine cars. All right.
Yeah.
People say that on average, it's the equivalent of running a traditional car for about 40,000 kilometers or 50,000 kilometers. Right. So
Mm.
you buy a traditional car, if you just ride 10,000 kilometers a year, you will have an advantage over, maybe your neighbor that does the same and bought an EV for 4 or 5 years. You still, so far my car has had less impact on the environment than yours, right? But then over the long run, if they keep running the car and so on, okay, the neighbor with the electric vehicle will be able at one point to say, my car has a lower impact overall
Well,
than
that's
your car.
assuming they're on the same battery. It's probably going to need a new battery
Right.
by then.
Yes. So it's, of course, it's complicated. It's always based on
Mm.
assumptions, right? Which is
Mm.
something we'll talk about again, I'm sure,
Hmm.
in the podcast. But you assume that the electric vehicle doesn't have an accident that basically means it's end of its life because it's happening much more with EVs than traditional cars, that they don't change the batteries and so on and so forth, right? Of course, of
Mm.
course. So when you look at the life cycle of a product and you do an assessment of that life cycle and all the impact of the products through the life cycle, that's what we mean, right? We
Yeah.
look from the extraction, processing, etc., of the material that go into the product, all the way to the point where the product is end of life. What happens? Can we recycle certain things and so on? Here also, batteries, are rather nasty, and I believe that not a high proportion of the batteries is actually recycled. Okay.
Mm.
The battery cells, I believe they are not mostly recycled. I'm not really sure. But the problem with a lot of these heavy metals that are in these batteries is if you just leave it in landfill, that's
Mm.
terrible because you have all these things that will go into the soil, might go into the water table and so on and so forth, right? I mean,
Mm.
and that will pollute the soil for how many years? We
Yeah.
don't know. So it is
Oh, if
much
you
worse than a traditional car. From
absolutely.
that aspect.
If you've been sleeping too well recently, read about the impact of batteries, like rechargeable batteries, on the environment and what's
Oh yeah.
happening when they go into the trash, right? And we've probably all done it. We've probably all thrown away an old electronic device with a rechargeable battery. Yeah, ideally you will take it to a recycling place. Whether it actually gets recycled or not, we don't know. But we've probably all done it. Like a really old phone or whatever, right? Well, if you read about the environmental impacts of these, oof, that is not nice reading. It's really scary stuff. We did write about this on Sofeast actually, so I'll leave a link. I'll find the material that we wrote. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not good. So you've gone through kind of what's included in a life cycle assessment, right? And we're talking about the materials that go into the product, the production processes, how it's being sold, used, being disposed of. I mean, we just talked about, batteries going into landfill and whatever. All of these things make up a life cycle assessment. Why is this actually an important tool that we need to consider if we are trying to manufacture sustainably, though?
Well, it's important to understand this idea of the product life cycle, and then to translate what happens in these, raw material extraction, processing, product production, whatever, distribution, use, disposal, etc. All of these phases, because otherwise you might be thinking maybe, hey, my product is more sustainable than that one, and so on and so forth. And you might be making false assumptions that are not based on data. And, a lot of countries have laws against false claims, right? So
Mm,
if you say, oh, this is a green product, but you don't actually back it up with data, you might get in trouble, especially in the EU. They have
mm,
regulations about that, about, how to, what you should say and not say. And, can you label your product as green? Say, oh, it's green, is whatever, it's more friendly to the environment and so on and so forth, if you don't have any basis for it, right?
mm,
So that's really what people need to understand, is that a life cycle assessment will translate, all of these activities that are necessary to make the product and get it to run and so on, and all the way to its disposal and maybe recycling, upcycling, or just goes to landfill or whatever. It translates all of these activities into, okay, so what's what exactly is happening here? Okay, so how many kilos, of steel, and how many kilos of paint, and how many kilos of whatever rubber goes into the tires, etc., and how much electricity does this process take, and so on and so forth, right? And how much scrap? I mean, it really takes all of these physical quantities,
mm,
and it translates that then with, databases. There's databases for that to translate it relatively easily into, okay, that means, consumption of that much energy, etc., etc. Okay, that means how much greenhouse gas emitted, how much consumption of natural resources. These are key things. And then at the end of the analysis, it's basically all added up, and the various activities, like, oh, we shipped it on a boat through the ocean, and then we put
mm,
it on a truck, and blah, 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 and then people were using it, and, and at the end, whatever, people have to bring it to a special place to dispose it, and so on and so forth. You add all of the impacts of all these activities, and you have a summary. Okay, that's the total impact of the product, right?
yeah.
And then you can compare, right? So there's there's ways to do it in a relatively professional manner. Of course, there's a lot of companies that will do that for you or help you do it. A lot of software also has been developed, and the software itself is not necessarily difficult to use, as long as the users have an understanding of, okay, that's the way it works, right? What are the boundaries that we're looking at? That's it's always based on assumptions and a scope, a certain
Mm,
scope of what exactly is the product, what product or product family are we looking at here, you know, and what can we get all this data? And that is actually the biggest difficulty, is actually getting the data. So
Mm.
If you are, I don't know, let's say Toyota, and you have been digging very deep into your supply chain, and you know you have visibility over your tier one suppliers, but also tier two, often tier three suppliers, sub suppliers, sub suppliers, sub suppliers. And you are a major company, a huge corporation, and you buy a lot. Okay, you can request data from them.
Mm.
Oh, okay, this thing, what is this? So there's a plastic part and there's a whatever. There's a LED chip and this and this and that. Okay, and a metal housing. Okay, there's like 5 elements. Okay, 5 elements. Each one, what's the composition? Where does it come from? Where is it made, etc. Okay. And your facility, what do? You assemble it, you do this processing, maybe you do plastic injection molding for the plastic part. Okay, give me all the utilities, consumption. Tell me how many kilos of what polymer you bought from what country. Oh, come from Saudi Arabia. Okay, so it's shipped all the way to this place here where you do that, blah blah blah. Okay, so you get all this data,
Mm.
you consolidate all that, and then the software will then be able to say, okay, based on the data in our database, this is equivalent to this much consumption of natural resources, this much emission of greenhouse gas, da, 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 da. And then they give you sort of a final number if you want, right?
Mm-hmm.
But getting all this data is is really a headache for a SME. Okay, that's
Yeah.
yeah, the big limitation, I would say.
Well, it's sometimes hard to even know who's supplying your suppliers. Like if you're dealing with
Right.
a Chinese manufacturer, for example, they might not tell you.
Oh yeah, and not just Chinese. We should
No,
not,
no,
bank too much on the Chinese for that.
no, no,
But
no.
it's particularly true for a lot of Chinese suppliers that kind of consider that my I don't know the value of my business is my network, and who I know is is what makes me successful. So why do you want to know who I know? I know them. That's enough. You know me. You why you want to know who's behind me, right? So that is a big headache for a lot of importers. Yeah. So
Mm.
what happens is in a lot of product categories, it's not a problem right now as I'm speaking, right? 2025, early 2025.
Mm-hmm.
But it is going to be more of a problem in the coming years. I think the mega trend is that the regulation, especially in the EU, will push for, we push the companies to disclose more information to consumers.
Mm.
The big idea in the European Commission is that, hey, we should give all the information to consumers clearly so that they can make up their mind, right? And this is going to put pressure the suppliers, and that's
Mm.
what's going to drive the suppliers to do a better job at that. Okay,
Mm.
to design their product in a more sustainable way, or to follow eco design principles, etc., and
Mm-hmm.
to be more transparent about the real impact of their product. And also, of course, if you label your product as green or something like that without actual evidence to back it up, that's greenwashing, and you're going
Mm.
to get in trouble because there's is it a directive or a regulation? I forgot, but it's not legal. It's not legal in the EU. Okay, and countries like the UK seems to be following what the EU says on that. Places like Australia, Canada, and some others are kind of going in the same direction.
Yep.
Now, with Trump, the US is kind of going in the other direction for now, but how long is that going to last? Right? Maybe just one term. So they might go in the pendulum swings like crazy in the US, like, Trump, Biden, then Trump again. Then who's it going to
Does at
be
the
next time?
moment.
So
Mm.
we don't really know. It's kind of hard to tell. But if you want to sell in countries of 400 million plus Europeans and so on and so forth, you should probably pay attention to that. It is a mega trend in the long run. So some EU regulations are calling for that. We had some clients in the building materials space that felt some pressure and had to collect some data. Okay. And then they found out that, oh, well, maybe we're a little bit early. It seems like, the customers are asking for it in the RFQ, but actually they're just trying to be future proof, sort of, when it becomes more serious in 1, 2, 3 years, but it's not so serious yet. This is kind of what we saw. But
this was in Europe. Was this in Europe?
yeah, right.
Yeah.
EU and UK.
Yeah.
And for construction materials, they have to actually even provide a declaration to their government. Okay, EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, I believe, so it stands for.
Yes.
So yeah, they you can't just make it up and fake the numbers and give them something, right? I mean,
No.
you might get in trouble. It's a declaration to your government, and do you want to commit fraud, basically, right? So it's coming up with certain types of products, right? Construction materials, maybe the fast fashion and textile in general will fall under that. Maybe also consumer electronic at one point, right?
Yeah.
Batteries. There's certain products that the EU Commission is really looking at closely. And they will set some rules, and it will come into effect little by little. And then their idea is that because all of the EU's customs will have the same database, same software, and at one point, every product and every batch, actually, of every production will need to have a product passport that will need to be pushed into that European database. Otherwise, they cannot even get onto the market, right? And because they will have artificial intelligence algorithms or agents or whatever, read through the product passports and various other information and pinpoint, okay, this is at risk. Not sure this is compliant, and then they will check it up closely. Their idea is that they're building, how to say, a trap, right, to catch the mice, a better trap over time, right? Right now is really, really bad at catching non-compliant products. It's very bad at discriminating. Okay, this is a good student that is doing his job, really is doing everything that is required, and this is a bad one that we should not allow to sell on the market. Frankly, they failed miserably, but they're working on something. They're working on something that will close the gap over time. How fast it's going to be, not sure, but by the end of the decade, it should, enforcement should be much, much more effective. So that's why we we talked about this in the past, and we keep mentioning regularly that these regulations are going to have an impact. Okay, they are going to have an impact. You should already be on top of the product safety regulations that apply to your product. Over time, the sustainability regulations will also need to be taken into account pretty seriously. It requires you to do the same things. Like, for example, for if you buy toys and you put toys on the EU market, you have to have a lot of information on what exactly is the composition of the different, let's say, components of the product. Okay. It's in the toy safety regulation that is coming in place, I believe, this year. Okay. So you really need to collect data, right, from your suppliers. Otherwise, you don't have this data, you are not compliant. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to be able to just test and kind of guess it. That's just not good. So that, transparency in the supply chain is going to be less and less of, let's say, a luxury and more of a basic requirement.
Mm. And part of that transparency is doing a life cycle assessment to understand the impact on the environment. And earlier on, when you were discussing Toyota, I was thinking some of the listeners, they're probably thinking, okay, that's fine for Toyota, a global giant. They're going to be under more scrutiny than me. I'm an SME, but you did mention, for SMEs, this is becoming more of a prominent topic, especially for the EU and UK, but also other countries. US, it's hard, isn't it? Cali, maybe, but yeah, the whole of the US, it's hard to say. But at the moment, if you're thinking, well, do I need to do this? It's not a legal obligation, right? But the LCA is a tool that's going to give you transparency over the sustainability of your supply chain and your product as it goes through its life cycle.
Yeah. First, understanding the life cycle and collecting some of the data, at least the big causes for, impact on the environment. Maybe you don't need to go, oh, this, whatever. Let's say it's a remote control and you say, well, there's like 1 gram of paint on the keys, the silicon keys. Should we go after that? Maybe first you do a initial run where you just look at the plastic injection molded casing and the silicon keys and what's inside, what are the battery, the PCBA, the big things. And then over time you can every 1 or 2 years sort of refresh it, ask your suppliers to provide more data and so on, right? It's not something that you do once and you're done, okay? You should be sort of teaching your suppliers that, hey, it's important and we should start to collect some data at least. And at one point it would be a legal obligation anyway. We don't know when, but it's going in that direction. Especially if you if you want in one of the categories I mentioned before, right? Anything that goes into construction, garments and some other textiles, consumer electronics, these types of things. Anything like an EV or e-scooter and so on. Okay, these are going to be the priorities in the EU.
Great.
So start collecting data, start making your suppliers aware of the needs. And over time, also have your product designers, or anybody who, basically provides guidance and direction of the design of your products, get them to understand that and see, oh, wow, okay. So, if we use that metal rather than that metal, oh, wow, aluminum is, has like how many, like 5 or 6 times the impact of steel in terms of greenhouse gas, then maybe, should we use steel rather than aluminum? Let's think about it, right? It's really about involving your supply chain and your product designers. And that's how over time you can show that you are driving improvement in your products. Maybe they don't qualify for being called sustainable, but at least, hey, this version is, much better than the previous one. And here's what we did. And here's the difference in the data, right? And that's how you can also appeal maybe to more discerning customers that pay attention to these kind of things.
Yeah, good point there. Also helps with product definition and being competitive if you're in that kind of market. Yeah, that's also a good point to remember. The good news is at Sofeast, we do help our clients with doing life cycle assessments. That's one of our services. So I'll leave the link to it and you can have a look at how it all works. I think we'll close it there. Renaud, some good early warning there to think about this kind of thing. And you've mentioned some of the other European directives. We've written on those before. So as is usual, links to those in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share, because it will really help others discover us too.